The Andrews government has today announced an inquiry tasked with assessing the ongoing effects of colonisation on Victoria's Indigenous community and charting a path, they say, to reconciliation and, of course, Victoria's planned treaty. The so-called Truth and Justice Commission will host hearings about the role colonisation and discrimination play in Indigenous social and economic disadvantage. Joining me from Brisbane to discuss this is the Director of Indigenous Programs at the Centre for Independent Studies and, of course, an Alice Springs counsellor, Jacinta Price. Jacinta, this people will probably pick up from the language of the title. It's modelled off the South African example where they had a truth-telling body set up by Nelson Mandela post-apartheid. But how on earth will this work in Victoria? Because in South Africa, of course, you were dealing with a really contemporary issue, trying to reform post-apartheid existing institutions. People had, real-time impacts with apartheid. What he's talking about here is asking people to go back 200 years. Of course, they weren't there. None of us were here 200 years ago to talk about colonisation. How is this meant to work?
Oh, look, I'm confused as to how it is supposed to work. The circumstances in Australia are completely different to South Africa, particularly during apartheid. I mean, we've got a situation here in Australia where you've got Indigenous Australians like myself who are of mixed heritage. In a city like Melbourne, over 80% of those who identify as Indigenous, in fact, partner with and have children with those who aren't Indigenous. It's confusing to me to understand how do people like that stand on a treaty? I mean, people of mixed heritage like myself supposed to sign a treaty with ourselves? The circumstances around Indigenous disadvantage also largely lie with those Indigenous people from remote and regional parts of Australia. In places like Melbourne and the bigger cities or towns, there are services available to Indigenous Australians just like every other Australian. The opportunities that exist are far greater and are available to all Australians, including those of Indigenous heritage. So, and when do we stop? Like, why aren't we recognising also, if we're going to go back 200 years, why aren't we recognising the trauma of convicts and now the ancestors, of those of us who came over and were dispossessed of their own land, brought to a completely foreign country and expected to rebuild and start an entire nation? Do we extend that level of truth-telling to that side of the story as well?
Yeah, I know it's not a related issue, but I'd love a bit of truth-telling from the Premier and his ministers who fronted a court inquiry. And for an event that happened this year, not 200 years ago, in 2020, they couldn't say anything about who made decisions that cost 800 lives. Yet we can go back, we're told in Victoria now, 200 years and talk about things and deaths and disadvantage that occurred, but no justice for the Australians, the Victorians in particular, that lost loved ones last year. I just find it is so wrong-headed to be going back the 200 years if they are not prepared, Indigenous issues in particular, to deal with the here and now. Because I know you've been speaking to Matt Cunningham, our correspondent in the NT. I mean, a whole lot of documents that have come out under FOI that show a really clear nexus between all the additional payments that went out in relation to COVID and increased drug and alcohol consumption, gambling, kids not going to school, and a really shocking increase in domestic violence. Now, I've got some statistics, I'll put them up on the screen. Over the last 12 months, domestic violence up 23% in Darwin, 31% in Katherine, 39% in Tennant Creek, 32% in your hometown of Alice Springs. If we want to talk about truth and justice now, we've got to talk about this stuff as well.
That's exactly right. I was having a conversation with an Aboriginal woman from the Northern Territory yesterday who said exactly those things. I asked her if she thought issues like racism were a concern to her, if she thought issues like constitutional recognition and the voice were a concern to her. And she said, there's no point in looking back in our past. We cannot change the past, but we have circumstances right now that we have to address. And all this talk about truth-telling, I certainly would like to understand and know when Indigenous Australians are prepared to look at the truth as to why we have the highest rates of suicide amongst our young people, and that's certainly within Victoria. We have the highest rates of domestic and family violence, and when are we going to take responsibility for all those issues ourselves? Because no one else is going to fix those problems for us. No amount of reparations from any government, no treaty signing is going to fix any of those issues, because they require us to solve those problems, no government. And, you know, I would like to know when we are actually going to confront those traumas that are occurring right now, every single day, day in, day out, instead of continuing to look back 200 years ago. You know, if it were in fact, you know, this idea of intergenerational trauma has such an impact, then after the Second World War, you would expect the Jewish people around the world to be living in similar sort of circumstances as Indigenous people in Australia. But that's not the case. We are in fact human, and we have to take responsibility for our own lives in order to bring about the change that is really required.
I tell you what, there is an election coming soon. We know the Warren Snowden, the Labor MP, is not going around again. Come on, Jacinta Price, I hope to God you run again.
Thanks a lot, Peter.